Hello, Richard Kretz. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I was wondering, could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Okay, a little bit about myself. I've been a student of esoterica or occultism most of my life. I've been a Mason, various bodies for over 20 years, uh, former military, been a performance consultant, working in the IT telecom industries, and have done quite a few things. For the past 20 years, I've been very involved with research or historical research of the Philosopher's Stone. Um, and with that in mind, I've actually found four aspects of it. And the aspect of the stone that I emphasize in my book, it regards the stone being a vehicle to attain a higher level consciousness, state of consciousness through meditation, to spiritually become at some point better than we once were. And it's a slow, methodical process that occurs with, time. And often we're not really aware of the changes that are occurring.
Yeah, I've definitely found that I do transcendental meditation. I've been in that for about 7 years now, every day, twice a day. And you don't at first really spot the differences, but what I've found is other people start to spot the differences before me. Actually, weirdly, my partner said she's noticed like over a period of 1 year, I sort of became far more. I listened a lot more, and it's strange, isn't it? How some of these things you have to be sort of patient with them, don't you?
Yes. I studied under the Maharishi back in 74.
Oh wow, that's cool.
Yeah, a little while ago.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting sort of endeavor. But yeah, so let's go, because you were a Freemason for a long time, and this book is quite Freemason heavy. Your new book, which we should mention, is the Alchemical Search for the Unified Field, on inner traditions, and oh, that's been a bang there. But it's very steeped in Freemasonry. And one thing, we've had Freemasons on the show before, but we've always kind of had this assumption that people kind of know the mechanics of Freemasonry and what Freemasonry actually is. But I think what would be interesting would be to kind of go into some of the basics of what Freemasonry actually is and why it was that you had to kind of go off on your own mission to really, discover these more esoteric origins and why it wasn't taught in Freemasonry. It might be interesting to look at some of that.
That's a very fair question. A lot of folks would like to know. Um, I, First of all, Masonry or Freemasonry is a very good organization. I mean, they've got some wonderful philanthropies. Uh, the intent is to help others, and that's very admirable. Uh, when you go through the degrees of Masonry, the three degrees, they're quite impressive. They leave a very strong impression or have an impact on you personally. And that's the intent of most initiations, regardless of, the fraternity or any other body. And that's wonderful. And as you're going through there, I mean, these degrees, it's just kind of overwhelming, and you get caught up in it, in what's going on. And then afterwards, you're reflecting on what really happened. What was I really going through? What was I experiencing? And as a result, these questions begin to bubble up to the surface. Like, what was this thing that they were doing with me? What does it mean? What are the secrets? You know, and so these are questions that I had. And in my time with the fraternity, I've discovered a lot of other guys have these same questions. And I would ask these questions, and I wasn't getting the answers that I was hoping to get. I was hoping that, okay, yeah, I'm a Mason now. I should be privy to the secrets of Freemasonry. No, that really wasn't the case. Um, so I started asking these questions, and the brothers were really good. They were knowledgeable to a certain extent about various things. But where I found difficulty was the explanations I was given were too often biblically oriented. They had some religious context. Okay, well, that's fine. And beyond that, if I started questioning that, they would go off into this philosophical existentialist, discussing, okay, the nature of humanity, and life and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's nice, but philosophy never does provide any answers. It's the nature of it. It's to ask questions. It's not to provide answers. Uh, so that really wasn't taking me anywhere. So if I continued to press, say, hey, really, what does this mean? Ultimately, I was told that my answers are found either in the rituals or the lectures, or you really don't need to know it. It has nothing to do with what we're doing. Well, if it doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing, why do we do it? What does it mean? And so the frustration would begin to build. And at the end of the day, what it amounts to is, as well intended and as knowledgeable as the brethren may be, they didn't know the secrets.
Yeah.
The secrets have been lost a long time ago. Um, our society has changed. Our cultures have changed. Our knowledge of things that were commonplace done even 100, 200 years ago has changed. And a lot of these techniques, these memories, this history has been lost for one reason or another, or it has been supplanted by other things that we today now perceive as truth that weren't even conceived of, many, many years ago. So there is this big cycle of change. Information, it just historically it gets lost. Um, and so I decided to set out on this quixotic quest and hoping I wouldn't be jousting with windmills and was looking for answers. I wanted to recover. My mission, was to attempt to recover some of this lost knowledge. Discover, okay, well, what were or what are these secrets? They're, what are they all about? And so it's been a very long process over many, many years. It's been a rough road. Uh, and as we would say in Masonry, ruffians have been countered thus along, and incidents have occurred. It's the nature of the beast. There is always going to be pushback. So, I started traveling down that path, and the more I learned, um, the more questions that I had, and the more it made some of my brothers uncomfortable. And not wishing to disrespect or offend any of them, I look at it this way: at some point when we're growing up, we have to leave home, and venture out on our own, and make our own way in life. And that's what my take was. I learned an awful lot, from my brothers, from the fraternity, and I choose to focus on the positive aspects of that experience. And there is a lot for anyone that's interested in becoming a Mason to learn and benefit from, through their affiliation with the fraternity.
One thing that's always interested me about the Masons, and we discussed this a little bit in our email conversation, is a lot. I see a lot of literature about Freemasonry where they attempt to make a link between the Masons and the Templars. I was wondering, could you, because I've seen counter rhetoric about this as well, where people say, "Well, that's not possible." But could you talk a little bit about that, because you do have a good take on this?
Whoa. Well, I mean, we could really go down a rabbit hole with that one. Yeah, but it's a popular misconception that all the Templars were Masons and all the Masons were Templars, and that's not true at all. Just to try and keep things simple, okay? And I'm not going to go into the history of Masonry or the history of the Templars. They were two, all I will say is they were two separate organizations that worked together. So when you had the Latin rule that St. Bernard developed back in, what was it, 1128 to 29, the Council of Troyes is when it was presented. That evolved later on, and I want to say it was sometime maybe in 1150-ish ballpark. I think it was under the French rules where they actually acknowledged Masonry as a category of Templars. They were using Masons as part of them, as an affiliate, to help build whatever structures they were building, whether it was to renovate a cathedral like Chartres or build another church or a palace or something. Yeah, they incorporated, Masons in order to assist in doing that. And then later on, as things evolved, once the Templars were dispersed after 1307, we find that the Freemason guilds or the stonemason guilds continue to exist. And when modern masonry came back around and it was getting off the ground and existing, it was predicated on the structure of the stonemason guilds. So especially those of the German guilds. I want to say it was Hanover. There was a meeting there where they had a Grand Lodge sometime in the 1400s. Don't hold me to that. It's just off the top of my head. But they used that structure in order to restructure or to reinvigorate the modern Freemasonry as a fraternal order. And from that point, instead of being operative as actual stonemasons, it became speculative, which, well, to my mind, when one speculates, it's a polite word for guessing. In other words, they use, symbolic attributes of various working tools to represent something more ethereal than literal.
Why do you think it is that Freemasonry's always been kind of the target of, say, conspiracy theorists, or it seems to be a group that, I mean, during the war it was picked on. Why does Freemasonry seem to be the butt of attack so often, you think, from these groups?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I don't know the actual answer to it. I can only speculate. And that would be fear of a group of people having knowledge, having secrets. Okay. And, when they have these secrets, they have this knowledge, and we don't know what it is. We become afraid of what can be done with what we think they have.
Yeah.
So, in that regard, it becomes, to say that this group or that good, for example, like the persecution of the witches, during medieval times, it was essentially the same idea. They had certain knowledge, skills, and abilities that the church didn't like, so, oh, we can't have that conflict because it was mostly women. The church is mostly men. We have to eradicate them, so we come up with all these charges. Ultimately, that's the same thing that happened with the Templars. They were accused of heresy. And what does heresy mean? Heresy means that you dare to question orthodox ways of thinking. You're not a conformist, and that makes folks in power very uncomfortable, that you dare to question. So the idea that, Masons have this knowledge, they have these secrets, and they're not willing to share them, That makes folks uncomfortable. So they begin coming up with various stories and ideas, uh, accusations and allegations that, oh, yeah, they can do this, they can do that, because they know things. But it has no basis in truth whatsoever. So there's the irony.
Hmm.
It's just as FDR once said, there's nothing to fear but fear itself.
Yeah, true. And can Masons join other orders, or is it, for example, there are other esoteric orders like Golden Dawn or um, OTO, or these other groups. Can they skip between different orders? I know that there are orders within orders in Freemasonry, but if is it frowned upon to be members of various orders at the same time, or?
Well, again, when you're looking at masonry, there is no king of masonry, so to speak. There's not an emperor. You have all these jurisdictions throughout the world. More often than not, they're predicated. These jurisdictions are predicated on a country. It could be a region in the Americas, within the United States. Each state has its own jurisdiction, um, and that governs what occurs within their geographic area. So to say that across the board, that membership in some of these other itinerant bodies is uh, accepted or tolerated or even approved, or that they are not, they're frowned upon and discouraged. Yeah, there isn't a clear answer to that. It depends on the jurisdiction that you happen to be in and the personality that you're dealing with. They all have their own opinions and their rationales. So, there's not a clear cut answer to it. I know many that are members of different bodies outside of Masonry, whether it's OTO, Golden Dawn, or some of the many others that are out there. And then I've also heard some that say, oh, no, you can't do that because it's frowned upon or you're not allowed to do it for whatever reason. So it can go both ways.
Okay, so let's get to the book. I mean, how long after leaving the order did you start researching for this book, or was it something you were researching throughout your time?
Oh, I've been actually doing the research on the stone, as I said earlier, and the Templars for well over 20 years. So, I was doing this research and I began doing some writings, publishing some small articles and that sort of thing. And I began to come up with enough volume of material that folks said, well, why isn't this in a book? Because, we would really like to have something that we can refer back to. And I said, okay. So I decided to say, let's take and put some of these things together, get it some structure, and, figure out what it is that folks really wanted. Number one, what do they want? What do they need? And how can we provide that for them? So that's how, I actually began putting the book together and why it's structured the way that it is.
Yeah, and you sort of structure it around the bell, the book, and the candle that the earlier on in the
Yes.
book. Yeah, could you go into a little bit of why you chose to do it that way, or?
Well, that's actually kind of fun. Because if you look at it, really, there's a movie, I think it has Jack Lemmon and Kim Novak and a few other named actors from the late 50s called Bell, Book, and Candle. And it has this cat in there, and they're supposed to be kind of like modern day witches. It's a romantic comedy. It's fun to watch, but no, the book really doesn't have anything to do with that. Uh, Folks often ask though, and I get a kick out of it. Then the other thing is, well, if you're very familiar with the occult, um, Bell, Book, and Candle is a reference to the Catholic Church an excommunication ritual of heretics, where they would ring the bell, they would actually close the book and extinguish the candle and say, "We're done with you. You were excommunicated. You're no longer a part of the church." However, on the opposite side of that coin, where my take is from a more occultist perspective, what you do is you ring the bell, you're calling attention, you're bringing attention as an initiate to say, "Hey, okay, I've got this awareness. Now what do I do with it?" And then you open the book so that you can learn. And then you light the candle so that you can spread your light, your knowledge of what you have learned. So that's really what my meaning behind veil, book, and candle is. It's to, call the initiates, is to say, okay, stimulate awareness, is to say, okay, we have to learn. We have to open a book and acquire knowledge. And then we have to go out and seek this light, by applying our knowledge in order to obtain wisdom. And that's pretty much the premise of it.
Hmm. So early on in the book, you talk about something called the Order of I can never pronounce this right. Ophiuchus, is it?
Yeah, some say Ophiuchus, some say Ophiuchus, and that provides the groundwork for understanding Masonry. All in a historical context, which again that relates to the bell, because and the reason for that is when you're initiated into Masonry, the first degree, you're just given some very high level background information. You really don't know what's going on. No secrets are revealed. It's just historical context. So that's what I'm providing, in the bell, in as the Order of Ophiuchus, saying, okay, yeah, this is a symbol and this is what it represents, and the background behind it, who Ophiuchus was, and then as we progress through the book, we can see, okay, well, this is how Ophiuchus, what he was, mythologically, is applied with an alchemical process or as a spiritual shamanic process. It always comes full circle, just like an Ouroboros.
Hmm. And so it might be for people who don't know who Ophiuchus is. I still can't say the word properly. Who could you talk a little bit about the kind of the myth of Ophiuchus and why that connection to alchemy exists, kind of thing?
Okay, Ophiuchus, if you're familiar with it, is symbolized by an Ouroboros. An Ouroboros is a serpent or a snake that is often depicted being in a circle consuming his own tail. And really, what that means, it's a beginning and an end. It's a never ending cycle. And that's really what Ophiuchus is. And we find him represented, in many ways, um, through mythology, including at Delphi, the Temple of Delphi, and you know we also find him as a constellation, in concert with Hercules and some of the other from an astrological perspective. Ophiuchus, if you're looking at traditional Western astrology, there are 12 houses, but in Chaldean astrology, there are 13, which is places Ophiuchus, which is only considered to rule from like late November to mid December. It's only for a few weeks. It's not even an entire month, towards the end of our solar year. But it's rather important, when you think about it, in that if Ophiuchus is the 13th house, looking at what number 13 actually means numerologically, and I'm not going to go down that road right now, but 13 actually is an important number. It's not bad luck. That came about as a result of the Templars being persecuted on Friday the 13th.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. So they have nothing to do with one another. However, the number 13 is actually 12 plus 1. And when we reflect on that, having Ophiuchus as, the head of the um, astrological houses makes sense. Because if you go into a courtroom, what do you have? You have a judge and 12 jurors, Jesus and 12 disciples, and we can go on and on with that representation, but it's 12 plus 1. It's not just straight out 13. I mean, if it was 13, we could do, theological or theological addition and reduction, and 13 would represent 1 plus 3 or 4, which is very stable. And again, in that context, yeah, 13 also makes sense.
and the next sort of, I guess, character within the book is Pythagoras, and this is another thing I've always kind of been quite. I was saying to you earlier, always been quite interested in alchemy, but Pythagorean theory and the kind of the so-called cult of Pythagoras has always really interested me. So, what drew you to Pythagoras in this book, or in this research, I should say?
Well, Pythagoras I found very intriguing because of the breadth and the depth of his knowledge, the extent of his travels, and what all he had been involved with. I mean, when you go back and you look at some of these things, it's not just the mathematics; it's how he approached mathematics. And geometry, and we refer to Pythagorean theorem, uh, which is actually an aspect of Euclidean geometry. Um, and he's looking at all of these things that are essentially the seven principles of the universal principles, whether it's the sense of mentalism or the all, gender, correspondence, cause and effect, vibration, all of these things. And he brings them together, and he was really a thoughtful force to reckon with in what he was thinking about. I mean, if you look at his Universal Musica, the songs of the universe, for someone back in 300 BC to even conceive that the planets themselves were vibrating and creating this vibration could be perceived as a musical note, that just blows my mind. Um, and the sequence of numbers. There's just very many things that Pythagoras did, and he thought of himself as a god, and many thought of him as a god, and he was associated in that regard with Apollo. Um, so yeah, Pythagoras is incredibly important and impactful, uh, not just within the occult world or esoterica, the orders of things, to understand, but mathematically. And whether we realize it or not, we interface with his ideas on a not just a regular basis, but a daily basis. Um, it's just, what he did was just, phenomenal.
And I referred to it earlier, but this sort of cult of Pythagoras, he actually formed almost like a mystery school, didn't he? That yeah,
Yeah.
it had like it had like a veil of secrecy over it, and almost an initiatic structure, I think.
Yes, it did. In that regard, I think it was based in, I want to say southern Italy, and I don't recall the name of the town off the top of my head. And he was a bit of a funny turn in that, yeah, he was a vegetarian, refused to eat beans, that kind of stuff. But yeah, he had a certain structure. They would have to take, some vows, in front of the oh, Virginia, I believe it was called, and they were limited. It was a silence and secrecy. They weren't allowed to discuss anything that they were involved in, and only if they, more often than not, and this was a common thing within most of your um, guilds that evolved later on. Apprentices really weren't allowed to have any conversations with their superiors for quite a long time. And it depends on what it was, whether it could be up to a year or more. Um, the whole idea was to listen and to learn. And you can't learn while you're talking.
I wonder why it was so secret. Why did he sort of put this veil of secrecy over the over this school? I don't. It seems strange. I'm not quite sure why. Do you have any idea?
I wish I did, but I'm not 2,300 years old to go back and be able to visit with him and ask that question, which I would love to do. But I'm sure they had the reasons. And again, he wasn't the only one that practiced that. I mean, it is common practice in many of the ancient orders or mystical orders, going back not just into Egypt, Greece or Egypt or even to Mesopotamia. And it was brought forward even into the guild structure. You didn't discuss matters of the guild with someone who was not a verified member. And that's where these ideas of signs and handshakes, certain secret words and things evolve from, because before you could have these conversations, you had to verify that were who they said they were, in order to keep your trade secrets secret.
Yeah, it's fair enough. So one thing you discuss in the book, sort of shortly after the Pythagorean stuff, is the kingdom of heaven, and this is another thing that's always interested me as well, because it's one of these things where I think a lot of people just think they're talking literally about heaven, but the actual term has a different kind of meaning, doesn't it? Really?
Yes, it does. Heaven is, something that we create within ourselves. Um, in that regard, yeah, it is very ethereal, because it's created in our minds. It doesn't isn't necessarily a physical place. I mean, it's possible that it could be, but it's an abstract that we create for ourselves. And it's the idea that it's a good place where we are the best that we can be, uh, physically, mentally, spiritually. And that's how we would really choose to present ourselves when our time on this earth expires. So, when someone passes, in that little piece in the book I put on that, the kingdom of heaven, um, why should we lament for them when, they're released from their physical bonds here? Uh, they're going to a better place. They're no longer, you know, being, challenged in difficult socioeconomic times, or physically, experiencing pain or suffering. They're being released to go to some place that is hopefully better, that they have created for themselves. And in that regard, we should really celebrate their lives, and that our lives touched, and cherish that memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it, I think. Um, One thing, this is a bit of a off-topic thing here, but it just suddenly sprung into my mind. The Obviously we're going to move on to discussing alchemy now, and we've been discussing Freemasonry, and we did an episode a few years ago about a character called the Count Saint Germain, and I was wondering if you've ever come across this character in your research, and if so, because he was an alchemist who was also a Freemason. He's just a very interesting character, and I was wondering if you'd ever encountered any kind of any writings about him or anything at all.
Count Saint Germain. I'm
Yeah,
not familiar with him.
he's somewhat of a mythical character, I suppose. Allegedly found the Philosopher's Stone and is alive still today. It's an interesting myth, but he
Yeah, I
certainly
mean,
existed.
I'm very familiar with, for example, with Nicholas Flamel,
Hmm.
who is alleged to have found the stone, and we still don't know if he's truly dead or not. He just might be running around as a time traveler. But we could look at that. We could look at Count Michael Meyer. Um, oh, you said Saint Germain.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking, it's Saint Germain. That would have been Francis Bacon.
Hmm. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, there's a story about Bacon as well that he didn't really die.
Hmm.
In 1626 is when he was alleged to have died, and the circumstances around his passing are rather interesting. They're curious in that supposedly he was out with somebody returning home, and he just wanted to see how well a chicken would keep if it was frozen. So he ended up taking this chicken out into the snow to bury it, something along that line. Ends up catching pneumonia and dying. But the question is, did he really die? Because the circumstances are just so bizarre.
Hmm.
And there was a story afterwards that he had actually gone over to France and then Germany, and I believe he ended up in the Austrian Alps uh, for at least a period of time and was known there. He stayed with this family, supposedly that has records of it, and was known as Saint Germain. Yes,
That's interesting.
Bacon was definitely an alchemist. He was an understudy, a protege of Dr. John Dee. Both were very, very familiar with the Philosopher's Stone and did a lot of work on that. What's also interesting at that same period of time, we're looking at the late 16th century, early 17th century. So, what I find most curious is that there were four folks that were alleged to have died, but may not have, that were alchemists in dealing with the Philosopher's Stone, one of which was Bacon, whom we just talked about as Saint Germain. Another would have been, what was his name? Kit, Christopher. Oh, I'm having a brain cramp here. Very well known. Then there was Edward de Vere, and of course Nicholas Flamel. So the circumstances around their disappearances, let us say. Oh, that's going to bug the dickens out of me until I can remember his last name. It wasn't Ren. I'm sure you know him quite well. They called him Kit, but his first name was Christopher.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
I know who you mean now. That's going to drive me mad as well.
he was supposedly he was supposedly murdered while having lunch
That's right.
or dinner, and that it was very suspicious with that as well. Again, Nicholas Flamel, his alleged passing was suspicious, and the same thing with Edward de Vere. And all of these guys had this association with Bacon and Dee, and were alchemists working on the Philosopher's Stone. Michael Meyer, whose illustration I touch on in my book, he was in that group as well. And then we can, get down into okay, the alchemical wedding that was put on by James the sixth slash first for his daughter Elizabeth with Count Frederick of Germany. Anyway, which was a real thing. It was a most curious time is about all I can say about it. I
Yeah.
mean, this is when you're looking at alchemy, this is when the period, 100-year period, is when you really have it at its apex, from say 1550 to maybe 1650. I mean, you've got D and Bacon and Kelly, who's the cheese slid off his cracker. Um, Boyle and Flood and all of these guys. It was just a fantastic period. But the question is, why were they so keen on the Philosopher's Stone? Why did they risk everything to try and find it or recreate it? And that's an unanswered question.
Yeah. Well, we've brought it, we've touched on it, so we should really sort of discuss it, I guess. What is the Philosopher's Stone?
Well, the Philosopher's Stone, again, I've been researching it for well over 20 years. Um, I'll begin by saying most folks think of the stone primarily as an alchemical process where you change lead into gold. Okay. That isn't actually correct, but that's what most folks think of the Philosopher's Stone, that it has something to do with change. In reality, I have found four aspects of the stone. The first is what I've discussed in my book, in that the one of the process of the stone is as a vehicle for us to attain a higher level of consciousness or enlightenment through meditation. It becomes a process of spiritual transformation. So, in that regard, yes, it is alchemical. From the second aspect is a strictly alchemical one, but one cannot literally physically change lead into gold. Lead is an element, and as such, it's pure. It has no impurities. So, what are we discussing alchemically? We're discussing taking something that has impurities. In this instance, it would be galena, which is a lead ore. And with the galena, what we do is we put it in this double boiler, this burner, and we burn off all the impurities, whether it's the mercury, the sulfide gases, and where it's nothing more than really ash with this little chunk of pure lead that remains. And on this lead, we have this whitish powder that's referred to as a bullion that contains silver and trace amounts of gold referred to as salts. We then take that bullion and we have to make another process and distill that down so that we can actually extract the silver and the gold. So galena actually is where we get a lot of silver from. But it does have very trace amounts of gold in it. So that's why it's the whole idea behind, okay, you can take, lead and change it into gold. You can do that, but not really. If you were going to do it literally, you would need a nuclear reaction. And it's just not worth it. It's too expensive, too much trouble. But that same process where we're doing it physically as an alchemist, burning off all this stuff, we're doing the same thing spiritually when we're trying to attain a higher level of consciousness. We're trying to take our raw animalistic selves, as Masons would say, this rough ashlar, this huge block of whatever, it's very rough and craggy. And we've got to chip away at it, or we've got to burn it down. We have to reduce it and get rid of all of the impurities. And spiritually, we're doing the same thing. We're divesting ourselves of the superfluities of life. We're burning off the impurities of our egos so that we can become better than we once were. And in Masonry, when we achieve that, we become a smooth ashlar. We've taken this huge rough ashlar, chiseled away at it a little bit at a time, to where it's now a very small rock that's smooth and polished. It can be fit into a temple, you know. It's something that we can be proud of. It's something that we venerate uh, because we've worked hard at it and we've removed all of these impurities. We've distilled ourselves. Um, the third aspect of the stone, to answer your question, is a very intriguing one. If and I don't get into this in the book. It's kind of like an aside. The only thing discussed in the book really is the alchemical and the spiritual process of transformation. Uh, the third and fourth aspects that I'm going to touch on, uh, actually, if you're looking at the um, illustration of Michael Meyer in his book Atalanta Fusions, it's emblem 21. And if you really take a hard look at that and decide to break it down, you'll find that in a two-dimensional depiction, it's going to look very much like the traditional symbol for a philosopher's stone in a two-dimensional geometric form where you've got a triangle within a square, or excuse me, a triangle within a circle within a square within a circle, that kind of thing. And that's great. That's our starting point. What we have to teach ourselves to do, and this is important if you're involved with the esoteric or the occultist, is learn how to see beyond. And this is what shamanism helped me to do, to be able to advance beyond my Western occultist thinking. And in thinking beyond, we have to be able to part the veils and see beyond. In this instance, what I'm talking about is taking a two-dimensional model of the Philosopher's Stone and envisioning it as a three-dimensional model. And once we do that, we'll find within it what are referred to as the five Platonic solids that were identified by Pythagoras. And they're nested in there kind of like Russian dolls, but they also interact with one another and they use vibration. And what this means to you is this model is potentially a vehicle for travel in the time space continuum, because you use the seven universal principles, and most of it has to do with vibration, frequency. And we find frequency in our five senses, whether it happens to be our vision using light, smell, our taste, sound. All of these things are predicated on vibration. And when we're looking at that, at this object, it emanates light, it uses vibration. And again, it could be a vehicle for travel in the space time continuum. That needs to be validated. At this point, I can't, say, yeah, it's validated or it's refuted, but I think it merits further investigation. The fourth aspect of the stone involves what we refer to as the elixir of life. And that's something else that folks may have heard of. Okay, well, what is the elixir of life? Well, some will tell you, oh, it's this flower or this plant that they use to mix up and extract something from. I I think it's something entirely different in that, again, going back to Meyer's model and looking at the Platonic solids, we find that these same Platonic solids in the way they're situated together, um, they form the mathematical base. How should I put this? A mathematical virology model for what's referred to as a biophagous organism. And these organisms were the largest DNA replicating means within the primordial soup of ancient Earth. In other words, they were the basis for life. Hmm. And as such, that we're looking at how this is done using what we call in Masonry the oblong square. and it can be used as it ends up, again, keeping things simple as much as I can. It looks a lot, ends up in a three-dimensional form as a capsule. And in this regard, it can be used as a vehicle for panspermia. In other words, not just the seeding of Earth, because these biophagous organisms are constantly bombarding Earth. And when we think about that, okay, if we've got biological organisms on asteroid dust or comet dust, whatever, coming into Earth's atmosphere, that naturally tells us, yes, there is life beyond Earth, but where and what?
Interesting.
So it's not a question of if there is something beyond us, it's where is it and what is it? It does exist. We've got proof of that every single day. And the interesting thing is that if you're looking at the basic components of life, the seed of life, or the flower of life, however you like to turn it, it's in capsule form. I mean, you look at what an egg is. For example, that of a honeybee, it looks like a little capsule. A grain of rice looks like a capsule. The seeds from a flower or a fern, they're small capsules. So that's what panspermia is. It's seeding life somewhere beyond where we are. And it's quite possible that life was seeded here because it was providing the DNA within the primordial soup where life began, billions of years ago.
That's
So those
interesting.
are the four aspects of the stone, if that answers your question.
Yeah, one thing you just mentioned it was the oblong square, and that's quite a big part of your book. Could you talk a little bit more about the oblong square, the kind of connections between alchemy and masonry again? There aren't there?
Yeah, there is. How should I put this? Okay, when you're in masonry, there's this reference to a thing that they say is the form of the lodge called an oblong square, and they provide this ethereal description of it. It's you know got these strange dimensions, but it's actually a very vague description. It's really difficult to say what it is. So I examined that and I said, okay, well, how do we define what this oblong square is? Well, we can take two squares that are conjoined, which will form an oblong of squares. So that's one way of looking at an oblong square. Um, Two squares that are conjoined that have a 2-to-1 ratio of their length to their width. Another way of looking at an oblong square is taking a square and rotating it 45 degrees, in which case the square is now in an oblong position as either a diamond or some would refer to it as a lozenge. So that's another way of looking at an oblong square. But to my mind, it had to be a little bit something more than that. And I decided to try and figure out what it is using geometry. So one of the big things in masonry is always, oh, this point within a circle. Well, what the heck does that mean? What's it got to do with anything? It has everything to do with a whole lot of things because you take these Masonic compasses or dividers, however you like to term them, and you would inscribe a circle. And as you inscribe this circle where you have that center point or that center point, you've got your point. You have a point within the circle. To create the oblong square, you do that. And then what you do is on either side, left and right, of this circle that you've inscribed, you inscribe two other circles so that their circumference will intersect the circumpoint of the first circle that you inscribed. So you have a chain of three circles that have within which are two Bishop Pisces. Okay, that's cool, but that still doesn't make sense as far as an oblong square. At that point, you would take and square the center circle, the first one that you first did. And then you erase all the stuff in the middle. And what you end up with is a racetrack. I said, I'll be darned. I got to looking at that. And what we find is that with regard to the Philosopher's Stone, that's oftentimes a description that we receive, that it's an oblong square. It's this oblong where the two ends are kind of rounded, but the sides are straight. So we find that when we're looking at Shiva Lingam stones from India. We find that when we're looking at the cartouches of the pharaohs in Egypt. We also find it in the cathedrals Notre Dame, in their floor plans that's integrated in there. And, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, hey, that's pretty cool. How can we take this a step further? Again, reflecting back on some of the things that we learn in Masonry, there's a reference to the fourth part of a circle. And that used to be a real head scratcher. What the dickens does that mean? Well, folks will say, well, traditionally, you take a fourth of a circle, and you end up with something that looks like a Pac-Man. It's a quarter of it is gone. Well, yeah, I guess you can look at it that way. That would be a fourth part of a circle. It could represent a number of things. But my mind is a little bit more flexible than that. What I did is I took this basic form that we just discussed about of the oblong square, and I said, well, what happens if I divide that into fourths? And I did it, and lo and behold, once I did that, I found that contained within that center circle, after it had been divided into fourths, was an encircled hexagram.
Mm.
And it was the same as I had found when I was initially doing the geometric model for the Philosopher's Stone, looking at it as a 2D model based on what Meyer and Flamel had designed. And it's like, I'll be damned, excuse my language, this is the flower of life. It's because you're finding this, Star of David, this, hexagram that's encircled, or a seal of Solomon in there. And that's what it represents. So you've got, in a 3D form, you have a capsule. This racetrack becomes a capsule in a 3D form. And then within it, you have this symbol for life. And a capsule, the really cool thing about it is they are structurally very, very resilient and can withstand the rigors of space. They withstand a lot of external pressure. It takes a lot. Just kind of like an egg, if you're pressing an egg from either end, it takes quite a bit of pressure to break that egg. From the inside coming out, it doesn't take much at all. But end to end, trying to put out external pressure on it, it's actually kind of difficult to break an egg. But yet inside of that egg, we have a yolk where at conception life has begun. You've got that divine spark, the union of opposites between male and female. It creates the divine spark. We have conception, and life begins within the yolk of that egg. That is the seed of life.
I think it was Mayers that he in your book you mentioned he came to the conclusion that the union of man and woman created this egg as well. It was like a so he felt that maybe part of the Philosopher's Stone was the union of man and woman. And
that's correct. Yeah, it's the union of opposites, and it's not necessarily a physical male or a physical female.
Feminine and the masculine.
It's masculine and feminine, and it comes back to what we had discussed earlier. It's this union of opposites. It's taking the pillar of Boaz and the pillar of Jachin, the male and the female, and trying to find this middle pillar, this compromise. So in that regard, you could say, and I touch on this book that may confuse some folks, where 1 plus 1 doesn't necessarily equal 2. 1 plus 1 equals 3, the third pillar. That's where we find equilibrium. That's our compromise. And that's our course between, the masculine and the feminine. And it's never a steady course. It fluctuates back and forth a little bit. Um, but that's how we navigate. And that's where we find our sense of balance, our sense of peace, and our sense of unity and harmony.
Yeah, and you sort of illustrate this with a like a ship going through the two pillars, don't you? And that was
Yes.
I thought that was and also the middle pillar is within Western esotericism. The middle pillar is a literal. I mean, the Golden Dawn have a thing called the middle pillar ritual, which is it's what you're saying is sort of ringing bells at the moment because I've studied that side of things quite a lot, and it's like, hang on, there's a you've both come to the same conclusion, it feels like.
Right. Well, and that's what's interesting is that, regardless of the order, the body that you're involved with, they have all these really fancy terms, and it's cool. You can kind of somewhat figure out what it is, but you're never really giving a direct answer
Yeah.
as an explanation as, okay, this is what the middle pillar is. Okay. Just give it to me straight. Don't give me all this song and dance and make me try to figure it out and guess it, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to be off the mark.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to help folks by saying, okay, here's a very succinct, clear, explanation of what these things are, what they mean. And with that, they hopefully will get these aha moments and, be able to move forward and, do better than they were once doing.
Yeah, because we were saying earlier before we started the interview, there's alchemists have there's a saying, is it obscure obscurum or something like that? But it's like deliberately obscuring the truth, isn't it?
Yes.
Um, why do they do that? What's the kind of the rationale behind that? Is it to create a challenge of some sort of pain point, or
Well, again, you have to understand the nature of the stone. Considering the four aspects that I was talking about, they they'll use all sorts of descriptions to, as you were saying, you know, camouflage what they're actually doing. In the case of Sir George Ripley, for example, he had this really long scroll. I forget how many feet long it was, and it used bestiaries to describe the alchemical process. Other folks you'll find use the symbols of religion, the kings and queens and knights, and that sort of thing. Um, it, and they're intentionally trying to obscure what it is they're doing. I think as much as maintaining a trade secret, to keep the competition from finding out what it is they actually know and are doing. That has a lot to do with it. Not that alchemists were going around and stealing another alchemist's work, but they were all searching to try and get this elusive philosopher's stone to recreate it somehow. Um, and if they were able to do that, they didn't want the competition to be able to do it. They want the exclusivity of it. Um, so it was kind of selfish. Yeah, they would share knowledge to a certain extent, but again, it was always in vague illustrations, of some sort, and even the language they would use, which oftentimes was metaphorical or allegorical, um, very, very confusing to the uninitiated. You really have, and you look at the alchemical symbols and what they represent, and it's, my goodness, you look at that, and it's not just another language. It's like, really, really difficult. And then, in addition to, what you might find in a generic sense with these symbols, each alchemist would have his own variations.
Yeah, so how would you utilize the Philosopher's Stone?
Okay. Well, early on in the book, I pose some questions. You have to ask yourself before you even begin your quest, to try and create the stone. What is it that I'm searching for? How am I going to recognize it? What am I going to do with it once I find it? And the answers to those questions are within yourself. You have to ask yourself, you know, what am I going to do with this if I find it? Why am I looking for it to begin with? These aren't difficult questions, but they're important questions to ask, because should you be fortunate enough to actually create it or find it, what will you do with it? And that, because if the stone does what it's alleged to do, it would be not just important, but incredibly powerful. If in And another thought along that line is, if the stone wasn't real, then why would the most influential and intelligent people throughout history have searched for it, risking everything in their quest to find it? If there wasn't something to it, why expend all that time and effort?
Hmm.
So there must be something to it.
There's no smoke without fire, as they say.
That's exactly right. So the end of the big question is, you have to answer those preceding questions and ask yourself, if I find it, what am I going to do with it? You know, Knowledge is power. So is it a matter of knowledge? Is it a matter of possession? Is it a matter of application? You know, these are important questions we have to think about. And perhaps that's why the alchemical process, regardless of how you're pursuing it, is so lengthy, you know, because and it's meditative in that regard, because we really have to reflect. We have to think about what it is we're doing, you know, why we're doing it, and what we hope to gain, at the end in our pursuit. Or are we Don Quixote chasing windmills?
Yeah. One thing, sort of wrapping up a bit, but the part of the book that really kind of surprised me, actually, in a good way, was that often, with books of this kind, where there's a Masonic element, there's an alchemical element, you don't often find a shamanic element in there. So that was quite refreshing, actually. You talk about this this shamanic relationship you had at the end with a character called Charles, and I was wondering, could you discuss Charles and like why this was such a important part of your life?
Right. I believe I alluded to it earlier on. When you're looking at Western mysticism, cult takes, it's very masculine in its orientation. It's very structured. There's a lot of discipline to it. Um, I had been doing this for most of my life, and I just got to this glass ceiling. I wasn't able to break through it. And about that time, I encountered Charles. I had just become a master mason. And Charles introduced me very slowly to this shamanic path. And within shamanism, it's in contrast to Western occult or mystical thinking. It's very feminine oriented, it's nature based, it's more emotional, more grounded and connected, and thoughtful in that regard. It has an easier flow to it. It doesn't have this rigid structure where you've got these parameters and you've got to stay in there. No, shamanism has this more greater flow to it. And so as I began learning more about shamanism through Charles's teachings, I found that I was offsetting this, counterbalancing, I guess is a better term, the masculine approach that I had been taking, the occultist approach. And I was becoming more balanced. And what I mean by that is that the nature based approach of shamanism was able to provide the offset and allow me to find this sense of balance, this equilibrium, this middle pillar, um, in the work I was doing. And with that, I was really able to move forward and do things I didn't even, previously think were possible. Um, expanding my knowledge base and skills and abilities. But the shamanism, it's a whole different way of thinking. Again, um, it's nature based. It's a lifestyle, is the best way I can describe it. Um, you become one with nature, one with the universe. And if you're familiar with Hermetic principles, we're discussing that of mentalism, the all. And really, the whole idea here is that from a Hermetic perspective, you can say that the all is part of everything and everything is part of the all. And that's actually part of living in harmony with nature. There's always a give and take. For every, you've got cause and effect. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You have to find this sense of harmony and this balance. And that is what, excuse me, I found so appealing within the Native American culture is this constant quest for harmony. Yeah, it's not necessarily whether something is good or bad. They don't assign, those definitions or those attributes to something. It's just this cycle of nature. It's just part of that cycle. It happens. You've got good and bad in everything, light and dark. We're trying to find this middle ground, where we find harmony. And that's where meditation comes into play, because that's what we're doing within meditation. We're trying to say, okay, within our bodies, we've got masculine aspects, we've got feminine aspects. What we want to do is find our middle pillar. And we can do that, and I describe it using electronics, where we've got sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, which are masculine and feminine. And then we've got the spinal column, which we've got ganglia in there that allow the crossover from, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves are masculine and feminine. So we've got a triad there. We've also got a triad in our mind. Our mind is kind of like a computer, but within there, we have our third eye. And everybody has, oh, yeah, I know all about the third eye. It's the pineal gland. Well, hey, that's wonderful, but the pineal gland is only one part of the third eye. It's called the third eye for a reason. And when you see it depicted, it's depicted within a pyramid, a triangle. And it has a reason for that. The third eye is actually comprised of the pineal gland, of course, the pituitary gland, and the thalamus. And from an electrical perspective, it functions as a harmonic generator. And that harmonic generator, if you can align that with the rest of your mind and your body and your spirit to get it to harmonize, it resonates. And that's how we're able to elevate and attain this higher level of consciousness, because we're in harmony. We really feel better. And that's what meditation helps us to do. And it's in alignment of our emotions, of our thoughts, and our decisions. getting everything lined up. And if you really want to look back at it, folks like Tesla said that if you understand 3, 6, and 9, then you understand the universe. And if you go forward, you'll find, many occultists will tell you about 3, but they truly don't understand it. 3 is an important number. It's the first geometric number that we have.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so that's why we find it in everything. Everything in nature has it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. I really appreciate it. If people want to find you online, where's the best place to find, to get in contact with you, or find other writings, or?
Okay. I now have my website up and it's live. They're welcome to visit that. Still working on it, but it's there. And you can visit it at stonedtemplar.com. And I'll say it again, it's stonedtemplar.com. Or you could, I have my author's page on Facebook, which is R.E. Kretz, and it should bring it up if you do a Facebook search on there. I'm not sure what other contact information that you may like.
I'm sure that's enough to get them started, I think. So what? Obviously, you have the book out now. Do you have? And I think in the book you say this is the first of a series of books. Um, do you have the next one planned out, ready, or?
I have it planned out. I probably, to be honest with you, have another, I'm going to say, a year and a half, maybe 2 years of work. Uh, Cranking out books like this is not an easy process. It's not like a guy that's writing historical fiction or something along that line where, okay, yeah, I only need a few bits and pieces. I have to go back and be able to, number one, okay, find the information and then make sure that it's sourced and vet the source so that I'm not speaking or addressing something inappropriately, or because that creates credibility problems. I'm trying to be as forthcoming as I can on these things to do it as accurately as possible. A lot of what I write about is original stuff, but again, I try to identify and document what those processes are so people can go back and replicate it. And that's the whole idea behind a scientific approach, is being able to replicate what has been previously done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Oh, well, thanks a lot. Again, this is a great conversation, and I'll have to get you back on again at some point because there's so many other things we could talk about in the book. So we'll have to definitely have another conversation soon.
Well, absolutely. It would be my pleasure, and I would look forward to that opportunity.